Welcome to UCL's first public Disagreeing Well event this year on the theme of what does reckoning with the British imperial past involve in 2026. My name is Hélène de Kringelbach. I'm an anthropologist. I am an associate professor of African anthropology at UCL. I work on questions of migration, mixed marriage between Senegal and Europe. I am very much myself the product of a colonial encounter between Senegal and France, shall I say. The legacy of colonialism takes lots of different forms, right? So before I introduce briefly the Disagreeing Well program and our esteemed panelists, I would like to read a tribute in memory of Eric and Jessica Huntley. Some of you might know them. So today we're greatly honored to remember Eric and Jessica Huntley, whose partnership transformed the landscape of Black British culture and political thought. They were Guyanese born, they were rooted in community, they founded the Bogle L'Ouverture publications in the late 1960s, a radical act at a time when Black voices were routinely excluded from British public life. From their home, and later from their bookshop in Ealing, they created a space where ideas could circulate freely, where writers and activists from across the African and Caribbean diaspora could speak, teach, challenge the status quo, laugh, perhaps even cry together. Their work was never just about books. It was about education, about self-determination, about resistance against racism and social injustice more broadly. They built an alternative intellectual infrastructure that confronted the silences of colonialism, which empowered communities to define their own narratives, and they were really keen to encourage young people to have a voice and to constructively fight back, not only in words, but also in actions. The Huntley Archives, which are the first Black collection at the London Archives in the City of London, is under the stewardship of Falmer, a charity they established to preserve this extraordinary legacy and to continue to inspire new generations. As we remember the Huntleys today, whose ordinary lives produced extraordinary change, we move into our panel with their spirit in mind. This is a panel that invites disagreement, interrogation, and honest engagement with the legacies of colonialism. The Huntleys taught us that challenging dominant narratives is important work, it's necessary work, and that through dialogue, even difficult dialogue, we build the futures they imagined. So the UCL Disagreeing Well program started 3 years ago. It aims to leverage research, writing, teaching to equip staff, students, and the wider public with the knowledge and skills to engage in constructive disagreement, including in areas of deep difference. And I would just invite you to look at the resources on the Disagreeing Well online hub. There is a video skills series with tips and advice on having better conversations. Just search UCL Disagreeing Well resources. Through this work, UCL aims to create spaces for open dialogue and informed debate in what, as I'm sure you will agree, is an increasingly polarized world. How do we listen to each other and take each other's perspectives seriously in the contemporary world? Tonight, you may hear things that challenge you, make you uncomfortable. You may hear views you don't agree with. But in the spirit of Disagreeing Well, we will ask the audience to suspend personal bias and to really listen with an open mind. We want you to generally consider alternative viewpoints, even if they feel challenging to you. So I'm now going to introduce the panelists one by one. I will ask them questions. Hopefully they will disagree in the way they address those questions, and then there will be a Q&A. So first, to the left, Satnam Sanghera, who is an author, broadcaster, and journalist, born to Punjabi parents in the West Midlands in 1976. He entered the education system unable to speak English at the time, but after attending Wolverhampton Grammar School, graduated from Christ College, Cambridge, with a first-class degree in English language and literature. Next, we have Lavinia Stennett, who is a writer, activist. She's a founder and CEO of the social enterprise, The Black Curriculum. So Lavinia founded The Black Curriculum in 2019, and she works to teach and to support the teaching of Black history all year round, aiming to empower students with a sense of identity and belonging. And she campaigns to bring about permanent change to the national curriculum to ensure that it's truly inclusive. And we're very honored because Lavinia is just back from Ghana, where she engaged with students at various Ghanaian universities on the issue of reparations. We have Professor Jovan Scott-Lewis, who is a professor of geography and has distinguished chair in economic disparities at the University of California, Berkeley. Jovan is also very familiar with British education. He did his PhD at the LSE, and his research looks at the histories of and contemporary experiences of economic inequality in the United States and the Caribbean. And finally, we're very honored to have Dr. Kwasi Kwarteng. For those who don't know, Dr. Kwasi Kwarteng has a PhD in economic history. Kwasi Kwarteng was the Conservative Member of Parliament for Spelthorne from 2010 to 2024. Many of you will know him as the Chancellor of the Exchequer in September-October 2022. He was also Secretary of State at the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy between 21 and 22, and was previously Minister of State for Business, Energy and Clean Growth between 2019 and 2021. So we have a fabulous and very diverse panel in terms of perspectives, hopefully. And really, I'm going to ask panelists a first question to get us started, which is probably an obvious one when we are thinking about reckoning with the British imperial past. There's been a groundswell of initiatives to reckon with the colonial past, not only in the UK, of course, but since the 1990s. France passed a law in 1999 recognizing the slave trade as a crime against humanity. There's been a lot of work from CARICOM resulting in the 2013 10-point resolution on reparations. An increasing number of African countries are breaking the taboo on African participation in the transatlantic slave trade. In March 2026, the UN voted a resolution declaring the slave trade the gravest crime against humanity. So there's been a lot of work from various parts of the world done in this area, but today we want to focus on Britain in this conversation. And I would like to ask each of the panelists why Britain should reckon with its imperial past today. What would you say to those who argue that the imperial past is indeed in the past, that we should focus our efforts on resolving social and economic issues today and looking to the future? So why look to this past? And if you do think it's critical for Britain to confront this history, then how might this be done? What kind of initiatives should we look to for inspiration? How might this be done? And I will start with you, Satnam.
Big question.
Yes.
You're free. Well, do I have to be controversial? Can I just point out very banal?
Just be yourself.
I think so. There are some very banal legacies of the British Empire which aren't difficult or controversial. I think this room would look very different if it wasn't for the British Empire. I think most of us wouldn't be here. Is that fair? Modern day multiculturalism is largely, but not entirely, can be explained by the British Empire. if you had a cup of tea this morning, that's because of the British Empire. You know, if you had sugar in it, that's mainly because of the British Empire. If at 6 o'clock in the evening you're having a rum and coke, or I don't know, a gin and tonic, both of those beverages can be explained by the British Empire. The existence of entire nations like Nigeria, Pakistan, cities like Nairobi, Calcutta, they'd be very, very different places if it wasn't for the British Empire. Entire corporations like BP, Shell, HSBC wouldn't exist if it wasn't for the British Empire. But more than that, I don't think you could really understand the news if you don't know the history of the British Empire, because so many of the controversies that are on our screens, Keir Starmer aside, can be explained by the British Empire. I mean, Israel, Palestine, I mean, the British definitely had a big role in creating that situation there. Kashmir, Sudan, Nigeria, actually, Kwasi writes about this very well.
About all the parts of Israel.
Actually, you don't talk about Israel.
I deliberately didn't write about that, but we'll go into that.
We'll go into that. Myanmar. And, you know, so given, you know, I think you say in your book a large proportion of our ongoing international conflicts in the world can be explained by the British Empire. We should probably understand our role in them, but also given because of the glory of Brexit. Thank you, Kwasi. Sorry.
Love it, love it. I wish I was single-handedly responsible for it. You've given me a much bigger role in history than I deserve.
Sorry. Given we're going out in the world and trying to re-establish relationships with the world, I think we should remember what happened the last time we went out in the world to have relationships on slightly different terms.
Lavinia, would you like to address this
Yeah.
question?
Can you hear me? Yes. So I would say that the importance of looking back is the fact that we still have a lot of the relics as well as the impacts that still last today. I think you've touched on a lot of them that we interact with on a daily basis, but we also have imagery, and imagery plays a huge role in the psychology and the consciousness of the British state. So we think about relics like the king and the monarchy. These are key parts of the imperial past that we are still seeing today, not only just seeing, but we're also impacted by the attacks. The second thing is also the climate crisis that exists across the world. If it wasn't for Britain and the colonial extraction, soil degradation, and so much other things that happened during the time of colonialism and also after, we wouldn't see how much unfair disadvantages certain countries, especially in the Caribbean, face. And I think last but not least, there is still a huge disparity in terms of people who are in Britain, particularly Black people. We look at health, workplace. These can all have its tie back to colonialism. And within that is the curriculum. So the curriculum, as you know or may not know, it is undergoing a curriculum review as of last year, but there is still very limited topics that touch on the role of Black history that isn't limited to slavery or enslavement or the trafficking of Africans. And that is the only narrative that really is forced. And yes, whilst teachers have the flexibility, as we've been told numerous times, to teach, Black history in diverse ways, the reality is if you're in Colchester or if you're in Durham and you're in the outskirts and not in a metropolitan area, as a teacher and you have no Black students in your class, there is no imperative for you to actually engage with these histories. And then that reinforces things that we see today, like reform. And some may disagree that, reform don't present a huge danger to our society, but a lot of the narratives that they are engaging with are very harmful and are based on a very unrealistic and untruthful past. And so I think it's really critical that our curriculum really centers the truth about British histories and also its present. So yeah.
Thanks. Jovan?
Thank you, Alice, and thank you for being here. I think, so part of the biography that was skipped was that from 21 to 23, I was a governor appointed member of the State of California Reparations Task Force. So for 2 years, what we did was we studied the kind of history of slavery and what we call as lingering effects in the state of California from 1850 to the present. And so I bring that up because I think it's relevant to your question, because what we found was that there were a lot of policy decisions made when the imagination of what a place was supposed to be and who that place was supposed to be for had a kind of knock-on effect about the way that future policies were produced. And so what that means is that today, a lot of the kind of frictions that we see in California society, in terms of inequality, in terms of wage gaps and birth gaps, in fact, have that precise history to kind of blame. And I think if we are, so Satnam gave us I think a very wonderful kind of like outward global, kind of effects of this imperial past. But I think there's something to kind of unearth in terms of a lot more the domestic experience of life in the UK by unearthing exactly how those imperial histories and the policies that were produced during that history impacts our kind of lived experience today. And so that's why I think it's really important for us to kind of think about this question. And after all, of course, as the Sheriff Trio says, the past is not past.
So far you all agree that it's absolutely critical to reckon with that past.
Yeah, I mean,
what about you,
look,
Preston?
I think, any history, not just British imperial history, has a use and people need to know about it.
And you've written about
And I've written about it. I mean, I wrote a book 15 years ago. And what struck me when I wrote the book was that very few people, British people, and generally white people, actually, people who are ethnically English, if you want to put it that way, they've got collective amnesia, most people, about Britain's role in empire, in colonization. People, as you said, Lavinia, they know a bit about the slave trade and they think that's bad, but they don't really know about 200 years of British rule in a lot of these countries. And that was what I was trying to say in the book. And the focus on the slave trade is important. But the British Empire, the slave trade was abolished in 1807, and the slavery was abolished in the British Empire in 1833. But so for 150 years after that, nearly, there was a colonial system that outwardly sort of preached equality under the law, but within itself had all sorts of laws that were discriminatory, biased. There were all kinds of rules and social hierarchies within the empire. And really, I think people need to be more aware. They don't need to think about it every day, but I think people of this country need to be more aware of that past, of that legacy. And the problems that Satnam was talking about across the world, they aren't all related to the slave trade. I mean, what the mess that has been made in Israel, Palestine, what we're seeing in Pakistan and India, which is still an ongoing tension, what's happened in Hong Kong with regard to China, all of these things, Sudan, these were things that really were put in place in terms of the difficulties at the end of the 19th century, possibly the beginning of the 20th century. So the British Empire is a lot more than, this debate, this important debate about reparations. And I think you can think two things. You can think, yes, we should know more about the British Empire, but you can also think, actually, we need to look forward and work out how a multicultural society works. And I think history informs a bit of that, but it's by no means, the panacea. I mean, you can know everything there is to know about the British Empire, but that doesn't mean you are equipped to deal with modern Britain. And so there are two things. You can deal with the history, you can understand the history, you can learn about it, but at the same time, people have to live their lives. And a lot of the legacies of empire simply just aren't understood. I mean, Lavinia made a brilliant point. Today is the King's Speech. That was a great, maybe still is, a great imperial event. The crown is called the imperial crown. A lot of the pageantry and the symbolism of it comes from an imperial culture. But a lot of that is just forgotten and lost, and I think it's important to get it back into people's consciousness.
Is that what motivated you to write your book, Ghosts of Empire?
Yeah, the book was motivated by a number of things. I mean, firstly, there was a book which some of you may know called Empire, written by Niall Ferguson. And that came out in 2003. And it's a shame he isn't on the panel. But, this was like gung-ho. The Empire was the best thing that ever happened. Everyone learned how to play cricket. Tea is a great drink. And I remember reading this book when it came out and thinking, this is crazy. But at the same time, and it's happened more lately, more recently, there was a counter view that the empire was literally the worst thing that ever happened. The British imperialists were like the Nazis. And I thought, well, it's somewhere in the middle, okay? There were lots of bad things, but there were other legacies that I would say have been positive. You know, I mean, I wouldn't recreate the empire, but I remember doing a literary event in India, and there was a big debate about language in India. So the BJP are very much trying to drive Hindi as a language and a universal language. And of course, there are so many different ethnic groups in India. And the guy that I was on a panel with was a BJP politician saying we've all got to make Hindi compulsory, we've got to abolish English as a national language. And the pushback was incredible. They said, no, we don't want everyone to learn Hindi. Firstly, we're not all Hindus. And secondly, English is our gateway to the modern world. And there was a huge appetite, not only to learn English, but to use the knowledge of English to work in a global environment. So it was a very contentious debate, but it was an interesting angle. I really got that sense that, you know, they thought, you know, colonialism was terrible, but they've got this thing, the English language, and they wanted to use it to make their lives better and to engage in a modern world. And that was what Satnam was saying. I mean, he didn't put it the way I've done it, but he was saying that there's so much in the modern world that we take for granted that happens to be a legacy of capitalism and empire. And of course, capitalism is the history of capitalism in the last 300 years globally is intrinsically linked with the history of empire.
Can I ask you a question? I've always wanted to ask you.
Go on.
And I loved your book.
I wanted other panelists to respond.
I loved your book, Ghost of Empire. It's a really thorough book. And actually, it's probably angrier than I feel about the history. Yeah, I think it's really angry. And I don't know if you've noticed, but your party has launched a culture war on empire. And lots of a certain part of your party is very nostalgic about empire. How does it feel? Where do you stand with that?
So I think that a lot of this and the reform and Lavinia is a pushback, because what they see is and this is what I loathe about modern political discourse, is that you see someone you don't like say something, so you say the opposite. Okay, so they see a whole bunch of people on the left saying the empire was the worst thing in the world. So without knowing anything about the empire, they say, no, it must be good. If these guys hate it, it must be fantastic. And so a lot of this is this crazy kind of, almost like a tennis match, you know, batting things, I don't want to make things flippant, but batting it back without actually trying to understand what's going on. I mean, none of these people know about the British legacy in Burma, for example, or the British legacy, we've talked about Israel, Palestine. Very few people actually, you know, will know what the Peel Commission was, or any of that. And I think it's the job of historians to try and bring some of that to light, because it's an important part of the discussion.
Is the question of education, and so Lavinia, I want to come back to you and ask, in terms of tackling this path through education, what has been done that you can point to as being successful, and what do you think needs to be done now?
Okay, so I would like to just posit that I do believe that the trafficking of Africans was and is the greatest crime against humanity and one of the greatest atrocities ever to exist. And to your point, Kosi, I just do also want to say that a lot of the other atrocities that happened thereafter had their time to be practiced during the centuries of enslavement and perfected. And so by the time the British had actually worked out how to do these things, we had, you know, suffered 12 million people and more actually lost within that time period. And so I think when it comes to education, we need to take an angle of like actually acknowledging that this is the greatest crime. And within that, it beholds us to really contemplate what would it mean for us as a society to lose everything we have, because that's really what we're arguing. If we're saying we live in a multicultural society, we're really working with the assumption that we accept this new form of empire, right? But if we're saying that enslavement was the greatest crime against humanity, and also we also believe that the British Empire doesn't have any moral or even economic claim to have this exist right now, what we need is to actually understand what the societies we live in would look like if we didn't have the labor of Africans who created the economies that we live in today. The ongoing extraction that exists on the African continent, the trade agreements that exist between countries, the financial debt that countries today still owe to formal imperial powers. And I think it's more than just saying, okay, this was bad. It's actually understanding the nuances and the continuity that exists, and then actually being willing to say all of this should collapse. Because really that's what we're arguing for. It's not, okay, we're just going to give you a sum of money and, that's it. And that's the end. It's actually dismantling a lot of the relations that I've just mentioned. And so I think our education really has to grapple more with the facts rather than just emotion to say that it was bad. Because I think whiteness also, and when I say whiteness, the power of white people in the society to say, slavery was bad, it can't stop with acknowledgement. And I think so often we just say, I agree it was bad, and then we end there, but there's no accountability, there's no audits, there's no action that's actually taken. And we've seen it with George Floyd. After the murder of George Floyd, companies, families, this is really bad. We acknowledge racism is a bad thing, but then it stopped with the acknowledgement. Maybe there was, for a year, some transactions, money flowing between companies and people, but ultimately there hasn't been any structural redress. And as I said, white people in particular have to be comfortable with actually saying, what does society look like if I have no power, no structural power? And that for me is the start of what we would say reparations is.
Yeah, I think you wanted to respond.
Well, the problem I have with the slavery debate, I mean, yes, it was, but it's so cartoonish. It's basically portrayed as a bunch of white people exploiting black people. Nobody ever talks about the Arab slave trade, which was going on for hundreds of years. Nobody ever talks about the complicity, the shameful complicity of African leaders within the continent who were facilitating the trade. I mean, it would never have happened if, people, my own people, the Ashanti, a whole bunch of other people were going out, conquering, capturing people, and then handing them over to white slavers. So yeah, the white people were terrible, but it was a much more nuanced picture. And I think the problem I have with this debate, appalling though slavery was that it's always sort of portrayed in this cartoonish way where, evil white people, capitalists, were exploiting black people. And a lot of that was to do with it, but there was a lot more going on. And I think it does people a disservice to portray history in that very, very simplistic way. I mean, nothing is simplistic in this world. We're human beings, and there are all sorts of varying emotions and all sorts of varying motivations across a whole bunch of people. I mean, that was the point I was trying to make in the book. The British Empire lasted 400 years and was 25% of the globe. So there were all sorts of things that were going on. And to reduce it to, there were a bunch of white people in Liverpool or wherever they were, trading Africans for 200 years, and that's all there was, I think is wrong.
Jovan, do you think the debate is as simplistic as Kwasi makes it?
Well, I mean, I think we've become quite accustomed to thinking about the matter of reparations as being simply about the harms that were done to specific populations. And I think what we have to try and figure out is that what we really are is accounting for the history of benefits to particular institutions for engaging. So absolutely, right? I mean, in America, it's fascinating because there's a movement in which African Americans are saying, well, actually, some Ashanti actually owe us reparations.
Yeah, I mean, that's the
right?
logic. That's the logic of that argument.
Absolutely. However, but when we are thinking about the institutions that actually prop up and reproduce society, when we think about banks, when we think about universities and museums and so forth, that effectively got their start within the industry of African enslavement, then we can begin to actually identify what those benefits were. Those are the receipts, in fact, that we should be paying attention to. So in California, and again, and I think it's important to bring up California. First of all, California's economy is bigger than the UK's, right? And it's just bigger, it's just bigger. But it has a very interesting and dynamic and very complex history with regard to these questions, because California was not a slave state. right? So California enters the Union as a free state, but was absolutely complicit in the project of enslavement due to its involvement in the Fugitive Slave Act, right? The fact that enslaved people were brought to California to work the gold mines and so forth. The fact that Chinese exclusion and native genocide. So California has everything, right? And a beautiful landscape. Come visit. So I think, but for us, it was really difficult to try and use purely a kind of harms-based model, because we're talking about when you have a predominantly African-American community that, first of all, becomes a community due to the unequal incorporation into a local economy, right? Then African-American neighborhood that is formed due to something called redlining and segregation. So you can only become a physical community due to racism. But then from that, is born a sense of identity, right? I come from this place. I come from Oakland. I come from South Central. And then gentrification comes in and takes away that basis for identification. So you have this kind of multiplicity and this cascading effect of harms that in terms of seeing how they impact particular individuals and particular communities, it gets really complicated. But what we can do is we can exactly trace how the state of California benefited from that history. And so I think when we're thinking about these questions, we should understand what it means to lose a social world, right? What it means also to then create a new one under new conditions, and then to lose it again and again and again. And this is the experience of Black life in the West, right? However, we do know what happened with Lloyd's, right? They've done that work. So reparations in that regard are actually quite easy. So it doesn't really require too much nuance, too much complexity, because we know exactly how Lloyd's benefited from enslavement, right? We can put a dollar figure to it because we put dollar figures to several harms in California. And so I think in that regard, it's a quite easy enterprise, is this matter of reparations. And I think the other part of it is something that's much more complicated, which how do you feel a sense of repair, right? And that is a societal question. But I think in terms of the debt that's owed, that's actually the simplest thing that we can do.
The issue of material reparations is quite simple. I'm sure there will be a lot of disagreement about that.
You're talking about institutions. I mean, you've been very specific about going to Lloyd's Bank and saying this is how the capital was seeded, this is where the money. But not every institution, even in finance in the West, will have such a clear link to what you're describing.
Right, and I think, but we have to start there, right? And I think because we have the question of the scope of injury is so large, we get to this point of impasse, right? We can't even imagine what it means to think about what it means to lose a name, right? To lose a history, to lose a heritage, to lose a sense of place. Like that's the harm of slavery, right? That's the way that it is felt. So reparations, Lloyd's can't repay, right? Lloyd's can't repair that, nor should they. But we do know that we have Lloyd's today because of a particular history of engagement with the reproduction of harms. And we do know that the question of time, right, and a statute of limitations is also not relevant, right? Because we know interest and assets compound, right? And so does the debt. Right? And so I think if we can attend to the material harms, and then we begin to think about, well, what are the populations who were impacted by that? Then that's a secondary conversation. But I think what we have to do is first and foremost identify the debt of benefits that is various institutions accrue, and then we can work from there.
What is your stance in relation to reparations? And should we conceive of them in material terms, or is that potentially other forms of repair?
My feeling is that in this country, we are so far from even beginning the conversation. I think the conversation exists in America, in California. In this country, I don't think we even accept what happened with slavery. I mean, Rishi Sunak was asked about reparations in Parliament. Did you see that? And he said, I wish people would stop unpicking history. And it's like, mate, you've just literally described what historians do. You know, Mary Beard unpicks Roman history. Simon Sharma unpicks the history of the Holocaust. Kwasi and I unpick the history of the British Empire. This is what happens. But this is also the way in which the British talk about slavery. They don't talk about it. They rather talk about abolition. And I would say, actually, they rather talk about the Arab slave. I hear them talking about.
They don't even talk about apartheid.
They don't even.
My point is a broader one. I think there's collective amnesia. You ask the average British person. I'd love to know how many people have heard of William Wilberforce or any of the slavers. I think literally, and this is where the curriculum is important. I mean, I was growing up in a world where you learned, there were 5 things you learnt on and you saw on TV. The Egyptians, Romans, Tudors, and Nazis. I can't remember what the 5th one was, but it had nothing to do with anything to do with the empire.
Yeah.
And decades of people were going through. So the empire, let's say it ended roughly in the 70s. There were for 40 years, there was nothing about any of this stuff. And it was only really with Rhodes Must Fall in 2015 that this debate started coming up into the public space. And I was always struck, my book came out in 2011, and I was always struck by how little actually people my age, but also people 20 years older than me and younger, they knew nothing about any of this stuff.
And there was immediately, I feel like the knowledge was just beginning to come out, immediately a massive backlash, huge backlash. I mean, think tanks, newspapers, trying to shut down the conversation, you know.
They still are. Yeah, they're still shutting it down. There's paid media propaganda to push out alternative facts, and to also come back to the point of amnesia. I don't think there's amnesia. I really don't. I really believe that people do remember because you see the king, you acknowledge the king, you acknowledge the royal family. But they can acknowledge the fact that there was a history there that empire is based on. So they know one version of this reality. But the underside of that, the underbelly, is that the people who built this empire are on another side of the world that they didn't see. So there isn't amnesia. It's just a limited view of the reality of what has happened. And also I think that there has been a lack of acknowledgement as well of the role of, because we think about these institutions, we say institutions, yes, let's do audits, let's go back. But we have to remember there are also families that, yes, have accessed their family history via the UCL Legacies of Slavery database. But there are people who know where their wealth came from. And those people are bound up within grant institutions, top firms that you wouldn't, to the outside world, you wouldn't recognize, but they're there. And I think it's really important, and we have to humanize this as well. As much as it is about, retribution from an institutional point of view, it's also about the people behind it who are very silent and actually just don't utilize their power or wealth accurately. So I would just like to add that to both of your points. Yeah.
On what the point you just made about amnesia, I mean, whether it's manufactured or whether it's just, I would agree. I've now become a British citizen. I became a British citizen a few years ago, and so I had to do the Life in the UK test. I studied the book.
Yeah, most Brits would fail that, by the way.
True, but from when it comes to the historical part, you are right, you do jump pretty much straight from the Tudors to the Blitz.
Yeah, so that's exactly right.
You jump over the empire.
Yeah, so it's Egyptians, Romans, there's a bit in the middle, I can't remember, Tudors and Nazis. And everyone who did A-level from about 1980 history to about probably today is doing a version of, 95% are doing a version of one of these things. And it's crazy. And amnesia is the wrong word. I think ignorance is probably a better word.
There's empire aspects to almost all those stories. You know what I mean? We would not have won World War II without the help of the hundreds of thousands of soldiers, the commodities and money.
Right.
Which you describe in your book.
And also the biggest loss of life on the Allied side was where? Do we know that? I bet we don't know that. I only learned this last year.
Well, in India.
No, the biggest loss of life in World War II on our side was where?
Was the Soviet Union?
No, it was the Bengal famine, 3 million people.
No, but I mean, okay, so you were talking about the West, but 27 million Soviet Russians.
Yeah, but on our, I mean,
I get what you're saying.
But no one knows that.
The Bengal famine, that's another thing that nobody remembers.
But also, I mean, there were black people in Henry VIII's court. Queen Elizabeth I helped set up the East India Company. There's empire aspects to all of that.
Right,
and we never talk about it.
Yeah.
I sat through dozens of Remembrance Day services in a very diverse school. Not once did anyone say, by the way, the Sikhs played a big role and there's just not mentioned.
Yeah, but again, I mean, you're my age, and this is something has only really in the last 10 or 15 years been a thing. You know, if you watched all the movies that we grew up with and heard the narrative, it was just a bunch of white guys fighting Nazis who were also white to liberate the world. And the participation you're talking about was kind of forgotten about.
Yeah, and then there's a Sikh soldier in a World War I movie, and Lawrence Fox loses his shit, you know, because there's a brown person on
That's
screen.
right.
It's seen as wokery gone mad, you know.
The question for you, because we only have a few minutes before we need to open up
Oh, right.
to the audience. Who should do the work of repair to whom? What would you say to those who argue that the British nation in its current form is multicultural, multiracial? Most Brits are not the descendants of either slave owners or British colonial officers. And therefore, you know, is the British nation as a whole the one that has to do the work of repair? Who should do this work, and who should it be for? Maybe Davinia?
I would say all of us. I think primarily repair is about understanding yourself in relation to others and in relation to this history that we're speaking about. And I think without accessing the archives, because also we haven't acknowledged the fact that a lot of this history has been deliberately hidden, deliberately removed, and also it's been made like in our education system, we have a very like, I'm going to give you the information that's correct. You don't have to just revise this. Once you revise it, you do your exam and you've passed, but there's no like interrogation or no encouragement to go back to the archives to go and actually understand this history more thoroughly. And I think if there was more emphasis on that type of agency for young people and just adults ourselves, we would be able to actually understand the depth of this history and actually to humanize this history a lot more. So I would say the first thing that we can all do is educate ourselves by going back to this history. And also, I think there's a key piece here around connecting the material parts that we've been speaking about, like the role of institutions. So for example, let's take Jamaica for an example. I'm Jamaican. We have an industry that is primarily tourism. Who owns the tourist industry in Jamaica? If you look at the owners of the hotels, they're largely Spanish. You look at the investors that are in Jamaica right now, it's Chinese. And there are all these links that we could start to make, right? And I think with, you know, weaving together these stories with facts, we can actually start to build up more clear audit pieces that allow us to actually identify what this history actually, the reality of that looks like, rather than just going back to say like, you know, Henry VIII had a black trumpeter. That's nice. That's really great. But like, how does that connect to today? And I think that's the key part. Like, our history doesn't have to just exist because of history. I love history. But it's not just something that we just need to meditate on. It's something that actually has an impact today. And so I think our role is to educate ourselves and give ourselves the opportunity to connect the past and the present, but doing active research. Yeah.
Great. Quasi.
So I, as you can imagine, have a slightly different view. I think we're disagreeing well, but the fact that a Chinese investor or a bunch of Chinese investors want to buy hotels in Jamaica because they think they can make money, it's got much more to do with global capitalism and the way that the international market works than anything to do with slavery. Well, you know, I mean,
Is capitalism not in continuity?
It's the
with
continuation.
colonialism?
I would say capitalism came before slavery because they did it because they were trying to make money, and it's pretty. And actually, your point about the archive is
Historians in the room,
they'll probably disagree, but it was. I mean, and I'm not a Marxist, but that's a classic. I mean, if you read Marx, he says that. Did you know that? I'm not a Marxist. Does anyone's work? But you know. There's a bit in Capital which I had to read for my book, but you know he describes the hunting of black skins. That's how he puts it, as the supreme example of what we call capitalism, or what he would call capital. You know, the capital, the bourgeoisie. That's what they were doing, and I don't massively disagree with that. I think it was very, very commercial, and actually I sort of gloss at Lavinia's point. I think the archives are horrifyingly clear and detailed about a lot of this stuff. If you go to the National Archive, you get a list of all the slave owners that were recompensed in 1835, I think it was.
Reparations were
W-
paid to
yeah,
all the
they were
slave
bought
owners.
out in 1835. And I know this because I was obviously in the Treasury briefly, but and a historian. 1835 was the 1 year from 1815 to 1914 where the British budget was in deficit. So 1 year, I remember, look, for 99 years, Britain ran a balanced budget, or it was a surplus. But the 1 year that there was a deficit, and someone can check this, was because they had to pay out slave owners.
And the loan that was taken was only finished repaying quite fairly recently, right?
So, and all of this is in terrifying detail. You know, it's not the record keeping. I wouldn't, you know, lots of things wrong about this country, but the record keeping is absolutely extraordinary. The record keeping is absolutely extraordinary. I mean, you can spend a couple of afternoons or a week in the National Archive and really break down all of this detail.
But you say in your own book about, you know, the establishing of Nigeria, the people who did that deliberately destroyed the evidence, Lugard, right?
Yeah, I mean, there was, so the thing which we haven't talked about is the fact that the only way that the empire could last as long as it did was through complicity of local elites. And that's why, you know, the white guys in Liverpool versus innocent black people in Africa is simplistic. That was because a lot of it, there was buy-in. I know. That's why I'm repeating it, but I'm pointing out that there was a whole system where they used local talent, local leaders. That was the whole point, and they brought them on side so that they could drive this thing. Because there were very few district commissioners. You look at a place like Nigeria, there would have been only a few hundred. In Sudan, there was a very thin layer of white colonialists. So they had to have local buy-in, and that's again another thing that's often forgotten.
I would quite like to give the word to Jovel, who hasn't had a chance
No, sorry.
to say something.
Oh, that was the House of Commons. So.
Well, I mean, you both mentioned the reparations debt that the public has in fact been paying for centuries, and that was, you know, finally paid off in 2015. And so in many ways, the public have already paid reparations, but just to the wrong people. You know, and I think there's something there, right? One, there's I think an established capacity for the state to actually, you know, make redress. I think there is the need for a kind of ethic and moral will for us to begin to value the people to whom we make that redress. But I am, you know, again, the work that I did for the 2 years, I think there is a really clear institutional record. This is what Kwasi just said, and I think this is where we do begin. I think we look at institutions. I think we begin to understand their history in the reproduction of these harms, and not just in slavery, right? I mean, there's this beautiful kind of power of thinking about slavery's lingering effects that I want us to take very seriously, because I think the notion that there's a detachment to slavery is right. Maybe it's amnesia, maybe it's ignorance, maybe it's just, you know, a lack of regard. And I think there are many things in society that are terrible problems that we simply ignore because we can't be bothered, or just quite inconvenient to think about it. And maybe for many people, slavery is one of those things. But I think the lingering effects are quite clear. I think the kind of challenges that we're facing in terms of our contemporary politics have everything to do with this history, right? How are different people and populations brought into society? The uneven terms. What are the kinds of cultural codes and norms that are built around those uneven terms? These are parts of empire's history in the everyday. So I think in terms of reparations, I mean, I think we start with institutions, and some of that work has begun here. You know, Glasgow, etc., the Church of England have begun to kind of think about these questions more seriously. And maybe that was just the George Floyd effect coming over here. So things do start in America and then happen elsewhere, right? And so I think maybe reparations might show up here, you know, properly, and I hope they do, and this panel is a part of that. But the question of by whom and to whom, I think we begin there. I think we begin structurally. I think we begin institutionally, and I say that not because it's easy, but because that's how everything has been done thus far. So, you know, when we think about the Windrush generation, right, we're talking about a set of national policies, right, that follow a line of earlier policies, right? When we think about the relationship between the crown and corporations, right? We're talking about the way that slavery was done and the way that a lot of other later kinds of, efforts at national development were accomplished. And so I think we don't have to reinvent the wheel, so to speak, right? Because I think the history of the state, the history of the nation, has been a history where both productive, right, progressive, but also incredibly regressive policies have found their way into everyday society, and we live with them. And I think this is just simply one other opportunity to do that and to maybe clear the balance in the process.
We would have gone to Q&A, but I think oh yes, we have. So I'm not able to see questions from the audience right now, but we do have expert questions, and I think we'll start with those, and then hopefully I'll be able to see the questions from the audience. So perhaps we could start with the first expert,
Yeah,
please.
okay. I'm Alan Lester. I'm a professor of historical geography at the University of Sussex with a specialism in British colonialism. I just wanted to make a quick point and then a question for the panel, if that's all right. Just to address the point that Kwasi was making about African complicity in the slave trade and the difficulty that institutes in terms of how we remember slavery and slavery's legacies. I think it is important to distinguish between the point of purchase of captives in the slave trade and the slave plantation economy that built the racial capitalism, which much of the panel are addressing, and where questions of distinctions between enslaved and free, exploiter and exploited were almost, not quite, but almost literally black and white. The question I have really is about whether there are two registers of public history and whether those two registers are indeed compatible, whether you can agree or disagree well over those two registers. And what prompted this was Satnam's challenge to Kwasi about the massive distinction, which I'm also aware of, between your book, Kwasi, which I rate very highly, and the reaction of your party when the kinds of things that you revealed in your book came to public attention much more generally after Black Lives Matter, and your party's resort to this culture war backlash that we've been hearing about, an immediate attempt to close down greater knowledge and greater understanding. And it makes me think that uniquely of any kind of academic discipline, history has these two public registers. One is the register that you displayed in your book, curiosity-driven research, because you want to know, you want to understand, you want to explain, you want to trace those historical continuities. And that's what most academic historians try to do. But the other register is a register of public history which is about the self, about identity. It's the story of how I came to be who I am, who I belong to, what I belong to, and who is not part of that belonging. And it's that register, looking back on the British Empire, which is particularly pronounced in that culture war backlash, and it leads to an ethno-nationalist response where people don't want to hear these histories because it complicates their sense of who they are and what their nation is in the present. And in that second register, it's not about the past, it's not about history, it's about the present, it's about the politics of today. And can we ever really bridge across those two very different registers and have a productive conversation when the approaches are so entirely different?
I think it's a question for you, Kwasi, and other panelists will have a chance to respond. But can I just invite the audience to use the QR code to ask your questions on Slido and then vote questions up. And I'm going to go through the questions that come through after the expert questions.
So the question about the trade and then the plantation system that was on the Caribbean and in the southern United States primarily, but in the United States, is a very important distinction. A lot of the focus is on the trade itself, and I think that's more complicated. The plantation system, in a way, I think has had more influence, particularly in the US, in terms of race relations than the trade itself. Obviously, it came from the trade, but the plantation system, you know, I didn't know anything about California. I just learned it was a free state and just assumed that, you know, slavery didn't have much to do with its formation. So I'm very interested in learning about that. That's a separate issue, and in a way, I think it's more relevant now. You can't disentangle them, but they're two slightly different things. And I was referring in terms of complicity, the complexities of complicity, if I can put it that way, to the trade. In terms of but it's like this. That's the nature of political discourse. Okay, so you have academics, you have researchers, you have amateurs who are interested in subjects, who will do research maybe, or they write books, or they even discuss things amongst their friends. And then everything in political discourse, you have to do, what, a 20-second soundbite, a 10-second soundbite. And so everything gets reduced to quite simple messages, which people then will vote on. Now, in a democratic system like we have, where attention spans are very short, people have got 1,001 different things to think about, the political language is crude and very direct. Now, can we do anything about that? I don't know. I haven't worked out what can be done. But I think that, and as I said earlier, a lot of the thinking on this is reaction. It's saying, well, these guys are saying this. They're telling me that the Trump phenomenon. We haven't even mentioned the T word, but that was very much a reaction against what people perceived to be a threat, and that they were demonized, they were deplorables, they were evil people. And then human nature as it is, if you say I'm evil, I'm going to say, well, F off.
How do you personally, because you're in such an interesting place with your work and with your position in politics, and I noticed, not to go on about your book, but your book, on the cover, there's a quote praising the book from one of the most imperially nostalgic of all the historians, Andrew Roberts. Right.
I think you read my book, by the way.
That's the thing. I thought he has not read the bloody book. But are you then saying to him, when you meet your colleagues?
Yeah, I see him. But look,
What do you say to them?
Look, I was a new historian. I was a first-year MP. I was delighted to get his endorsement. But I agree. When I read it, I thought
You've not read the book.
But I'm sure people have. Your book's fantastic. But I'm sure you got lots of praise for it. But did they all read the book?
Yeah.
Okay, he did.
Of course it is.
Oh, I can't come back to that.
Jovan and Lavinia, would you like to say something before we move on to the next second expert question? There's lots of questions from the audience, so don't worry if let's move on. I think there is a second expert question, am I right? So yeah, we can't see where the second expert is.
Hi, hello. My name is Dr. Lee McGray. I'm the founder of House of Dread. I have quite a lot to say, but I'm going to keep it quite straightforward. I've been thinking a lot about, I suppose, the word heritage. I've been thinking a lot about, particularly what you were saying, Jovan, about the lingering effects and manifestations of imperialism. And I think it's quite interesting, in fact, this panel and the ways in which disproportionately a lot of these conversations seem to fall on those with the particular lived experiences of the topics that we're talking about. But one of the things that I suppose I've been thinking about is really about these questions of preservation, but specifically care. And thinking about a lot of these conversations is really a conversation between structure and agency. Who is the agents and what is the structure? So I suppose the question that I'm really getting at is, what does it really meaningfully mean to kind of reckon with colonial inheritance that's looking beyond this kind of politics of representation and inclusion, multiculturalism? What kinds of structures of care, and when I talk about that, I'm talking about materially, institutionally, and ethically, are actually required to sustain these histories and communities and embodied forms of knowledge that empire attempted to fragment. And I suppose this for me is really reflecting on what Kwasi was saying about we need to move forward. So as part of that moving forward, what would it mean to develop these structures of care in our real life?
Who would like to take this? Jovan, would you like to have a go?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for the question. So I think one of the primary crises that we're facing is a crisis of understanding what our national projects are. I think, the the kind of energy of identity and its contestations that have gotten us where we are today, I think have been largely expended. And so we've fallen back into a different kind of tribalism, I think, that works absolutely against. No, you're all right, man.
About,
Um,
not about anything you said.
so anyway, and I think, so much of this question is about we have finally, like in the United States, I think we have tried to figure out in the moment post George Floyd, and I can kind of see you here, so I'm just using this thing. There's a question of what it means to have a kind of contemporary society and how we work out our place in it. And what we have found is that the moment we're in, and in my work I call this moment a kind of reparative conjuncture, is that we have finally been able to identify the various kinds of injuries that have formed our societies, And I think the narrative historically has been to absolutely look past or gloss over the fact that a whole host of atrocities are actually what makes our societies possible. The fact that, again, California, I don't know, I'm not an ambassador for California, but the fact that Native people had to be removed, right? The fact that people had to be brought under terrible conditions, right? The fact that their very livelihoods could be, manipulated at the whim of industry, at the whim of the state. I think we are finally at the point where we're recognizing that all of these terrible things are actually what produce the societies that we have today. And I think we're fundamentally conflicted about that fact. I think we love the fact that we have same-day shipping through Amazon. I think we are absolutely unwilling to reckon with the fact that it's ongoing inequalities that make that same-day shipping possible. And I think so at scale, this is what's happening in our society right now. And so I think what we have to first do, and this gets back to this question of care, right, is we have to first have an imagination, an imaginary of what caring means, right? We have to understand what it means to decide who belongs in the society. And I think what we're facing right now are the ongoing contestations about that very specific question. And I think we are finally confronted with the very stakes of what it means to answer that question, because what we have is a society that has been created through a different ethic, an ethic of exclusivity, right? Where it was never meant to be for everybody. And there simply isn't enough to go around. There isn't. So what do we do with that, right? And I think if we can begin to kind of figure out that question, and I think it does start with care, then we can maybe get to some of these broader mechanisms and maybe policies one day about how to kind of build a different kind of society, because that's fundamentally what we have to do.
There are lots of questions from the audience, so I'll select some of the ones that have been voted up. And the first one I'd like to ask the panel is, compared to how other European countries deal with their role in colonialism, what is special about what the UK is doing, either good or bad or both? So who would like to take this one? How are we different?
It's notable how deep our amnesia is. I think we are not the only country in the world with a problem with empire. If there was one country that has a problem with this empire nostalgia in the world, it's Russia, right? It invaded Ukraine. Arguably, America has problems with the idea of being an empire now, wants to take over Greenland and move the indigenous people in the middle of America and so on. But in Europe, it feels like the Netherlands have done some work. The royal family apologized. They've set up academic working groups to work out these issues. Feels like the French did a certain amount of work in relation to museums. I mean, it's all really bad. Germany paid reparations to its very small empire. And it feels like we are sorry? Oh, what do they call them instead? There's a long German word for it. But I feel like we're in a particular world of amnesia, and it's got something to do with the size of our empire, biggest empire in human history, and it's also got something to do with us being an island. We were so separated from our empire, we could act like it never happened. when it was over and when it was happening. So I think that's created a particular psychological problem here. And this is why I think even America is better at dealing with these issues than Britain. And we tend to look down on America, as being more fucked up than us on everything.
I think, yes, please, if you want.
No. Can I just add a small thing? So, in terms of referring to the book, I mean, the other thing that people forget, we haven't talked at all about class. I mean, I mentioned Marx. But if you look at the British Empire, and I did all of, I spent about 2 or 3 years researching the book, 3 years. The actual people, the cadre of people in Britain who were running this empire were from a very, very narrow group of people. They were all men, they were all white, they went to about 15 schools, most of them. You look at somewhere like Sudan, they were all Oxbridge people.
With that.
The thing was they were boxing, they were blues.
Yeah.
So I have a chapter called Blacks and Blues, because that's how they called the Sudan. Because in Arabic it's the land of the blacks, Sudan. But they were run by these Oxbridge Blues, and for 50 years, again, very well documented who these people were, where they were coming from. And I think that's something that's often forgotten. So a lot of people, from working class backgrounds, they wouldn't necessarily have much connection. Yes, Uncle Bert was in Burma in World War II. There's that. But in terms of the administrative structure of it, it was a very narrow cadre of people. And I think that's often forgotten as well.
There is a question here about whether there will ever come to a point where the reckoning will be sufficient. And if so, what would it look like?
Well, as I said earlier, I think if there is to be any true recognition of what's happened, there would be no modern day economies as we see it, because the money, the wealth, the buildings, everything that's gone into it would have to be dismantled in order for true equality. And we're not even taking into consideration within this argument the lives, of course, which you can't really put any numbers to. But I would say, and it kind of connects back to your question, Nima, around what does care look like? What does true equality and connection look like? I think it really is in organizing. I think sometimes these conversations can be very disjointed. I studied myself in New Zealand for 3 months with Indigenous people, the Maoris, and they had done so much work, courts of healing. From the Treaty of Waitangi to this day, there's still so much ongoing discourse that I think sometimes in the work of reparations and in our healing, we kind of look inward, whereas I think we need to also look outward and really reimagine what that looks like. So I think for me, it's about having societies and education systems where we're actually able to take into consideration different viewpoints and ways of challenging systems that we haven't done here. Because why has it taken us, how many years is it, 9 years for the curriculum review to happen? It really shouldn't happen, right? We should have ongoing conversations around what our education system looks like, especially if those children are in formal education. And I think without that kind of unity or even perspective of who's involved in this conversation, we kind of lose sight and start talking to these powers that be. So, it brings on comments that have very audacious undertones, like Keir Starmer last year, who said that there will be no reparations. How dare he? How dare you be the authority on deciding that? And I think that happens when we focus so much on the powers that be, rather than actually looking at what does connected organizing look like across the diaspora, as well as outside of our own nationalities and ethnicities as well. So I really think we have to include the Indigenous community. I think that's this period, because their land, it happened first to them, right? So, yeah.
Can I give a more banal and less articulate response to what does it look like? It looks like Northern Ireland. We forget that Ireland was part of the empire. We forget that I think the Good Friday Agreement was a process of post-colonial truth and reconciliation. We can do it. We did it. There was money paid out. It was called investment. You could call it reparations. There were apologies. Tony Blair apologized for the potato famine and for other things. And, as a result of that very difficult process of post-colonial truth and reconciliation, Ireland is a healthier country. There's less violence. We do have it in us. I think sometimes maybe the words put people off. If you call that reparations, people will be like, oh God. And I think we did a version of reparations with Kenya. We were forced to do it. We were sued. And it was to do with the Mau Mau. And William Hague, I don't know if anyone remembers, was forced to apologise as Foreign Secretary. We paid out £20 million, we had to, and there was an apology made. And that, at the end of that, recently King Charles had quite a healthy visit to Kenya where he met the victims of colonial violence. And there were actual real conversations had. So I do think we have it within us to do this, but sometimes the scale of the problem can put us off.
Yeah. Please think there needs to be like a conversation with those who are most vulnerable as well, because I don't think it's up to us here to decide what that looks like, because we're not like, if in comparison we're really saying our reparations here in the UK, it's nothing in comparison to those who are suffering climate crises in the Caribbean and in Africa. So I think it really needs them to be a part of that conversation rather than, I don't think they would want an apology personally. CARICOM says that, but I don't think that's the be-all and end-all.
There's a question here on the statues. We haven't talked about statues. We could put that together with the issue of museums. But someone is asking whether the whole conversation around pulling down statues is helpful at all, or is it just a distraction? And you may also want to think about the conversation around the repatriation of museum objects or other items of heritage.
Do you care about statues?
I do care about statues. I don't think they should be ripped down. No, I think you should explain who these people are and what they did. But the idea you can't just erase history. The fact, I can't remember who it was in Bristol. Was it Colston, Edward Colston? That's part of Bristol's history, and I want people to know about that. But I think there should be an explanation of who he was and what he did, because to me, and I'm old enough to remember the Soviet Union, I mean, rewriting history is what the Soviets did. They used to airbrush people out of pictures.
Not history, it's one person's view about one person at one point in history.
That is history.
But that statue's been torn out. It's now in an art gallery, I think.
I wouldn't put it back.
It's actually-
but I'm just saying that I wouldn't tear them down in the first place.
I think very distinguished historians in this country have pointed out that nobody's learned much history from just passing by a statue.
Yeah.
No, but it should be explained what the significance.
They're the street furniture, aren't they? I mean, even if you did that, no one would look.
No, they probably would.
Would you stop and look?
Yeah, I mean, I get to Trafalgar Square every day. I apart from Nelson, I'm not sure I would be able to name. There's a guy who was in India, but I wouldn't be able to name all the people around that. And I'm a historian. I've got a PhD in the subject, so I don't know.
To me, this conversation is very much 2015, 2020, and I think
2015.
we really need to move forward, because I think it is equivalent to reducing the argument of reparations to very forms of representation. And I think the more pertinent question is what is going on with the artifacts that are in the bottom of the British Library. I think we need to really start to engage with those types of artifacts, objects that do not belong there. And I believe that those will have more of an impact in terms of actually repairing the harms that have been done. With that being said, the statue should fall.
Agreement, great. Someone is asking whether you can decolonize systems while taking into account all of the global contexts, nuance, diversity. So is decolonization too broad a concept, or is there mileage to this idea of decolonization? Jovan.
Is decolonization too broad a term? Is that what the question is asking? I don't know. I mean, I think I've lost a little bit of patience with that, especially in the US, where so many things were decolonized and it's like nothing has changed, and so much effort and resources go into these kinds of processes. And going back to one of the earlier questions, I think we need to start imagining what we want our societies to look like. And so even way back to one of the earlier questions you ask, in my work, I try to distinguish between reparations and repair. Right? Reparations are the cold transactional, again, accounts that can be identified that, complicit parties are responsible for Repair is the ongoing work of world making, of deciding what societies want to become, what communities within those societies want to become. So the point about Northern Ireland is taken, but there's a basis of a place-based relation that not all harmed communities have, right? And I think the idea of what does that mean? Should Lavinia and I go back to Jamaica and be there and have our country? I mean, there's a country there. But what does that mean for the kinds of relationships that have been formed, over decades in the UK? And so I think for me, there's a question of decolonization that also has really come into the discourse on reparations, which I think is what you're making in your point about the statues, is that like how much work are we going to put into, thinking about white supremacy? Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture once said that the Civil Rights Act in America wasn't for black people. It was for white people, to let them know, in fact, that black people are humans, allowed to enter into swimming pools and to various establishments. And so I think the fact is that so much of the labor of black activism has been simply to improve white society, right? The whole George Floyd moment has been a kind of moral exercise in making certain people reckon with the fact that they have privilege and so forth. Okay, great. If you have it, nice. Now, what else can we do? And I think so for me, the question of decolonization is important, but I think it's a question about what are we improving through decolonization? And this is, I worry about the soundbite thing you said earlier. I was on Piers Morgan once and I was terrified. But it was great. He was lovely. But I don't want this to be taken as a, Professor Javon Scott Lewis is anti-decolonization, right? But the point is that I think there's a lot of work that black communities have not been afforded to do for themselves because they have been so busy improving white supremacist systems. And what I'm saying is that reparations are owed because certain institutions have benefited, they should be paid. And I mean paid. And I am 100% for cash-based reparations. Let's put that on the record and you can quote me and all the other things online. And in distribution of that, right, black people should be allowed to figure out what they want for themselves, what they want their relationships to be to the United Kingdom. During the Civil War, right, so we all are familiar with the 40 acres and a mule, right? So 40 acres and a mule comes from the fact that contraband slaves, meaning enslaved people who had crossed Union lines during the war, were asked, with emancipation, what do you want? And the answer was simple. We want land, tools, and to be left alone. When you actually look at the history of harms against black people in the West, those harms are actually the repeated interruption into societies that black people have produced despite the ongoing external segregation and racism. So what we have is a capacity for black communities to build life for themselves on their own terms, to be integrated into society. If we think about Jim Crow, and we think about segregated spaces, white spaces, black spaces, there were whites-only spaces. You never saw blacks-only spaces in America because black spaces were always multicultural spaces. So we know how to live with people. We know how to share our things. The problem is that when we develop these things and we want to share these things, they keep getting taken. They keep getting stolen. They keep getting demolished. And so I think the question of decolonization is important, but I'm tired of improving white society because it's ineffective, right? It's made a mess of the world. And I think if we can maybe learn from other people who have been able to devise, right, systems of sociality and have shown that they can in fact work and use it as a model, then listen, then like civil rights, then you can learn about the universal humanity of other people. And then the question of decolonization is irrelevant, in my view.
I recognize this notion of tiredness. Someone is asking a very practical question.
There are far exits.
No,
But you can see that.
but it's a great question. How could a young person start a conversation with wealthy relatives about the colonial origins of their wealth? How could a young person start a conversation with wealthy relatives about the colonial origins of their wealth.
I mean,
I don't have any wealthy relatives.
rock party for us, but I can give an anecdote. We are familiar with the Trevelyan family, who found out about their wealth, which was tied and came through the UCL Legacies of Slavery database, and we did a documentary on it. It's on YouTube. It's called Omitted. It wasn't just about that, but it was about the topic of reparations, and we featured John Dower, who is the cousin of Laura Trevelyan, and basically that whole process for him was a whole reckoning, and the conversation came about because he heard about it through the article by David Balasoga, and then basically inputted the information on the database, and the conversation is still ongoing. It's not just a one and done, and I think that's the key part of recognizing and understanding this history is always going to be contested, even within a family space. And what does that wealth now do, I think, is the primary question. And so I think the first thing to answer the question is to actually just find out wherever you can, whether that is through just conversation or entering on a database or just even Googling your history, finding out where that material wealth has come from and where is it been embedded, and then actually identifying, who are the recipients as well, because as much as the conversation is within the family, it's also connected to Grenada, because that is where the source of the money came from. And so that conversation, I think, I'm speaking on behalf of them right now, but I understand that they have been speaking to the people of Grenada and actually finding out how that money has been, basically what could the money that they've gained go towards and help and advance the people of Grenada with. But I think primarily it's really about identifying the source of that wealth, if that person has passed, and finding out where it's gone. And yeah, I think, to be honest, it's really just having honest conversations, because I think many people are still scared to even acknowledge great grandma, she profited, and that money, even though she might not have said that it was money, the wealth, the legacy, the name, because a lot of it is also about honor and respect. Where has that gone, and what is that benefiting me today? I think those are the kind of questions that needs to be asked. It's not just where it was, is what's happening now, and how can we engage with the people who need to be engaged with this conversation. So yeah.
In relation to that, I would like to invite you all to check the amazing work that's been done at the UCL Center for the study of legacies of British slavery, which has done really granular, really excellent work on tracing the source of the wealth that was made from slavery, but also things like how the reparations money was actually, what the reparations money was actually used for in the 19th century.
Can I come in on this? Okay, we'll move on through.
I will actually allow you to speak in just a second. I have two, just because there are two questions which I'd like to take together, and I'd like you to answer them first. I think they're related. One of them is related to international aid. It's asking how we can discuss the British Empire when former colonies are still dependent on international aid from former colonial powers, including the UK. So hinting at the fact that there's continuity between colonialism and international aid. And there was another question which I think is related, on how we can convince the electorate to support reparations, particularly when spent abroad. So, of course, reparations and international aid are different, but I think you'd be quite well placed to address this.
Made a very interesting point about vocabulary. So he said that the Germans don't call, or you said, I think, the Germans don't call whatever aid they're giving to Namibia reparations. But I think this whole issue of international aid, coming as it was after the Second World War, and you look at the policy debates, running underneath that is this sense that, look, we've been bad guys, we've exploited people, we need to help them. And there's very much, and it's not explicitly said, but if we'd said in 1945 that every penny of aid should be called reparations, there would have been political pushback, but a lot of the sentiment was there. I'm not saying it was enough, but a lot of the sentiment, there was a feeling that we have a duty in the West to give aid to countries that we've exploited. Now, I'm not saying that that's should take the place of reparations, or that is a substitute of it. But there was this this tie between the two. And the other thing I wanted to say in relation to, you know, tracking down the wealth of families and the Church of England and all this sort of thing. I think 150 years ago, maybe 100 years ago, that would have been a very interesting debate. The fact is, if you're looking at wealth, there's been vast amounts of wealth that have been created in the last 20 or 30 years, which is where relates to the electorate. That's what they're worried about. They're worried about people like Elon Musk. Okay, he's in the US. They're worried about, you know, people, you know, tech billionaires. They're worried about all sorts of things to do with the capitalist system that aren't directly or I mean, they are ultimately linked, but they're separate from, you know, tracing what the Trevelyan's did in Grenada, you know, in 1750, and then going after, you know, their money or whatever and making them, I mean, they're noble people, they're very decent people, but I don't think that's kind of frankly where the whole debate about wealth, inequality, redistribution, if that's what you want to do, I don't think it's got anything to do with that. It seems to me a somewhat sort of navel-gazing historical archaeology, if you like, which isn't really relevant to modern politics.
I'm sure they disagree for some years.
I mean, I think I'm probably in between you two as a centrist. And I think the institution or the family or the people who could do really good work here is the royal family. First of all, it's their job, you know. Secondly, almost everything about them, as you said, goes back to empire. The jewels, lots of them from India, Burma, the mahogany furniture in their palaces from the Caribbean, ivory, or so much ivory that Prince William himself recently said he wanted to get rid of it all. But also more than that, it's only recently, in the recent years, come out, their involvement in the Royal African Company, which was the one institution that was more involved in the British transatlantic slave trade than any other. You know, and when they arrived in Barbados, these enslaved people, they had the initials of the Duke of York and the Royal African Company branded into their flesh. And given the royal family are the head of the Commonwealth, lots of former imperial countries who want to talk about this, they could do amazing work just by talking about it, just an apology, or they don't even have to pay money. It would be amazing education. You know, it would be amazing international relations when at a point at which the Commonwealth is struggling for a meaning, because you've got a country that doesn't want to talk about it, Britain, and you've got a load of countries that do want to talk about it. Wouldn't it be great to use the Commonwealth as a kind of a body for post-colonial truth and reconciliation? It's there for the taking, but I think King Charles would probably want to do that, but I think the people who run the royal family, and I think the politicians, would never do it.
Yeah, and also they've got people's bodies, hair, still bound up within their power. So Prince Elemeahu of Ethiopia, his remains need to be returned, right? And I think there are some really dark parts of the histories, not only of the royal family, but of these families that we don't even know, because it's still within, it's protected and it's secret. And I think part of that discovery really calls us to be honest about the dark parts of colonialism that are still very present, but maybe not taught. And I think also on the topic of aid with conditions is still colonialism with plausible deniability. It's just, it maintains that connection similar to the Commonwealth. And so I think a future actually dismantles all of those systems and those structures. And I think, yes, of course, it's big picture thinking, but we need to start there, because we will still have these reforms that look like it's reparative justice, but really it's just allowing wealth to continue to be bound up whilst having the kind of facade of progress. So I think we actually do need bigger and more bolder steps to be taken.
You want to add something to this, or should I move on to the next question?
Because the second question related to the electorate, and I think as far as the electorate, as an MP, I engaged with the electorate, and my sense was that people who were, let's say, more left-leaning were not actually focused on these issues. I find them deeply interesting because of my background, and I think, you know, the Trevelyan's link to Grenada is of interest, and it's very meaningful and poignant and tragic. But I don't think this is a subject which is going to engage vast numbers of voters, even of ethnic backgrounds. You know, we're not interested in figuring out, what the Trevelyan's made or what the Lassalls made, all these people.
Maybe not
We're more
reparations, but
interested in, so far as if they're on the left, they'll be more interested in redistribution of, some tech billionaire or what's AI doing. There are bigger issues to do with capitalism, with inequality, with the creation of wealth, beyond this
I
very
think you're right.
moment.
They're
fascinating
exercised about
debate.
bigger issues. But if you look at public opinion surveys, something like 3/4 of people think it's a great idea to teach kids about empire and colonialism. The majority of British people think that the British Empire was a mix of good and bad. These are quite nuanced views. And I think the British public do care, but probably not compared to their standard of living and tax and stuff like that.
When there's a wealth tax being debated,
Yeah.
people aren't looking at the archaeology of that or the origins of that and saying, actually, you guys owned a plantation in Jamaica, and therefore you should, that's part of the debate. I mean, it was interesting because I was an MP with a guy called Richard Drax,
Yeah.
and he had 2 plantations, his family had 2 plantations, one in Barbados, one in Jamaica. And so when he came to the House of Commons, when I did in 2010, it was kind of an issue because, this guy's wealth, they did a form of money laundering. I mean, he's a friend of mine, so, but I don't blame him for this. But they ran an estate in the Caribbean from about 1650 roughly to 1750. But even then, it was kind of tainted money. Even though everything was legal, there was a sort of shame to it. So then they just sort of reversed and bought this huge estate, which he still owns, in Dorset. And the point of that story is a lot of this is very ancient history, which we should understand, but I don't think it's going to engage a modern electorate, frankly, in the UK.
If I may abuse my position as chair, I would object to the fact that this is ancient history because you mentioned big tech, and big tech, some of the wealth from the big tech today also comes from exploiting cheap labor in former colonies. It's not completely disconnected.
Let's try and have some sort of analytical distinctions between slavery, the plantation system, and people exploiting manufacturing laborers in Southeast Asia. I mean, you can say it's similar, but it's a different thing we're talking about, I think.
I think it's the same. I think there's a part of the timeline that we're not talking about, which is migration. These are very flagrant issues that are still being weaponized today from the far right. So it's kind of reductive to say that there's no link between them. Migration, you have poverty that still exists in the UK. Many people, especially that came from former colonies, are placed within situations of lower socioeconomic areas, and they, from schooling to housing, there's so many issues, and I think these are things that people do care about, but the framing of it just needs more context, and without it being something that is, because we talk about migration as if it's just happened. There's a current behind it that is linked to what we're speaking about.
We should talk about this forever. But
There are 2 questions on race, which I'll take together because they're coming at it from a different perspective, but they're related. One of them is no one has talked about race, but we know that it is the empire that has taught us to think racially. How do we undo that? How do we undo thinking racially? And the other question is coming at race from a different perspective. It's saying Imperial Britain invented anti-Black racism as we know it today. Do you agree or disagree? So it's this issue of the link between race today.
I don't think the British invented anti-Black racism. I think you just need to go to the Congo. I've done quite a lot of research. I've got another book coming out about the Congo and what was going on there. I think if you go back before that, there's a whole history of slavers coming in from places like the Gulf. The land of the blacks, which is what Sudan means in Arabic, was seen as a treasure trove of slaves. So I don't think Imperial Britain invented that. It might have developed it. It might have exploited it. There were thinkers in Britain, Darwin and others, who were more racially conscious even than Darwin, who came up with theories of racism. but I don't think Imperial Britain invented it.
But it's massively influential.
I mean, I would say it's probably the single most influential incubator and propagator of racism in the 19th century, you know, because of its size, right? And culturally, I mean, just look at a poem like White Man's Burden by Rudyard Kipling.
I mean, that's a bit more nuanced than...
But also that poem, the history of that poem is really interesting because it was written by Kipling to the American president. Tell it to the Americans saying, you should do in the Philippines what Britain has done with the brown and black people in the British Empire. And it just shows you what was happening, you know. Britain was spreading its racist ideas. And also when racial science emerged, it wasn't entirely British, but British scientists were just disproportionately, probably at institutions like this, involved in that weird racial science. You can see those books where, you know, Sikh bodies are analysed and explain why we are a martial race. And as you can tell, I'm
very
not.
martial.
You know, and I think that's of our amnesia, that is the really problematic thing, and we struggle with because we beat the evil racist eugenicist Nazis. The idea that we might have been involved in creating that fucked up racial science that led to the Nazis, I think that is almost, you can't discuss that in Britain because it challenges us in such profound ways.
Like, I mean, you were an anthropologist. I mean, I'm doing research. And I mean, the first chair of anthropology is sort of 1860s, 1870s. And it's coming immediately after this sort of Darwinian, you know, the hierarchy of evolution. And there's that Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford with all those, I mean, all of those, a lot of these disciplines, subjects that have a lot of respectability are coming out of this sort of thinking.
Yes, they had a dark history. Agreed.
Yeah.
I mean, I think Stuart Hall said what race is the modality in which classes lived, right? And I think what we have, how many issues? Stuart Hall? No? Oh, okay. So when we think about that, when we think about the notion that race is a modality in which classes lived, what we're talking about is this history of underdevelopment coming from slavery, coming through colonialism, post-colonialism, where you have classes of people, right, who then have to be categorized and classified to be made useful, to be made productive. And we see that, you know, in immigration policy, we see that, you know, in everyday discourse as well. And so, you know, if you are structurally positioned, you know, within the bottom of this hierarchy, and that position is then given a, you know, what did Fanon call it? The epidermalization, right? Then you operate as a sign. And that sign then has social value, has social functionality, and this is what we're trying to deal with. So I think to answer the question of if we can kind of disabuse ourselves of this notion of thinking racially, no. I mean, I think we still have these structural distinctions that are very much, you know, ordering our societies. I think there's a longer history going back to the Enlightenment, actually, in which we think about conquest, we think about the very notion of you know, demarcating who actually qualifies as a human in the first place, much less where you rank among humans.
He's a Swedish naturalist, right?
Well, I mean, so yeah, Linnaeus, you have De la Casas, you have these debates that have long gone on about what counts as a human being, and who are fit for purpose for certain kinds of labor, right? And so the Irish, right, the Slavs, all kinds of people occupy these positions in the kind of history of the British imaginary of labor. And so I think once we kind of reckon with what the class question is, you know, then we can begin to kind of deal with the question of race. But until then, I don't know how you do it when I just walk around looking like I belong in a particular place.
That is a great place at which to end the questions. There are more from the audience, but unfortunately, we're running out of time. Please.
No, because you mentioned it. Why didn't you include Israel-Palestine in your book?
So the problem, so there were two decisions. So I read about 6 countries, areas in the book, and Kenya and Israel would have been very interesting to deal with. But firstly, it required its own expertise in terms of languages and the history. I mean, the whole book's on this. And I thought that it would have distorted the reception of the book. Because and particularly now, right? If you write about 8 bits of the British Empire, and Israel is one of them, everyone's going to talk about what you think about Israel. It's going to drown out everything else in the book. That was my view then, and it's even more the case now.
So, on this note, I would like to invite you all to attend the next two Disagreeing Well events. The next one is the 2nd of June. It's going to be Trust Your News Feed, Journalism in the Age of Misinformation at the Great Debate. 2nd of July, Disagreeing Well, Is Politics Corrupting Religion? And on that note, I will invite our provost, Dr. Michael Spence, who is the initiator of Disagreeing Well, to say the closing remarks.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
What an extraordinary panel. And I suppose I couldn't help noticing a great irony that we were talking about the use and abuses of history under these great banners that say UCL 200. And I felt a certain personal complicity in the use of and abuse of history as we tell stories. The past, it's a complicated place. You know, the British were spending lives on the West African squadron in 1826 when the university was founded, returning people who had been enslaved at the same time as that same British Navy was deeply complicit in the system that had produced slavery and that was oppressing people all over the world. Here at UCL, we tell the story, and you spoke so eloquently about questions of who counts as a human. We tell the story with great shame about our own involvement in eugenics, particularly as regards the ways in which racialized persons were regarded as less than human, and yet we're proud of our work in modern genetics, and don't really ask a question about what it means to be a differently abled person at the same time. The past is a morally complex and difficult place, and the present is too. And the way we cut through that, as one of the questioners said, is to tell very simple stories about who we are and where we've come from. Very simple stories that, yes, might sometimes cover up in the way that I think the panel kept rightly referring to. There has been a great cover-up of so many of those stories in our simple histories, but also that we sometimes tell because in this morally complex world we want to be the best versions of ourselves. So I tell a story about the foundational narrative of UCL, about how it was to be a place that was welcome to all. Well, not quite all, of course, but welcome to all. About it was how it was a place that was to improve the lives of many, and yet not all, of course. I tell a simple story about the history of UCL because I want us to be the best version of ourselves. And in the process, I'm complicit in covering up so much of that moral complexity of our story and so much of the wrong that we've been complicit in, and that is a part of the story of who we are too. And so I think this panel has been extraordinary not only in the ways that it's unpacked the complicity of all of us in this country in things of which we ought rightly to be ashamed, but also in the way that it's made us think about our complicity in telling and retelling simple stories, as, yes, we try to cover up, but also even as we try to be the best versions of ourselves. And a university should be a place where this kind of conversation happens, where the complexity of those things is opened up, and where then we think about what it means to build the kind of society that we do want to live in, that does reflect our collective best version of ourselves. So thank you so much for just an extraordinary panel, that it has been a great privilege and sometimes quite painful to listen to. I would like to invite all of you now to join with me in thanking the panel for a remarkable conversation.